They thought they'd captured a female SEAL. That's what they told themselves when they zip-tied her wrists behind her back and shoved that black hood over her head. That's what they believed when they dragged her into that concrete room and forced her down onto that metal chair. 9 Marines. 9 men who'd convinced themselves they were apex predators. 9 fools who had no idea what they'd just walked into. Because what they didn't realize, what they couldn't comprehend in their arrogant, testosterone-drunk minds, was that she was trained to escape rooms exactly like this. She'd been taught by people who understood that capture wasn't the end of the game. It was just another playing field. And she was about to show them exactly what that meant. They were laughing. That's what gets me. That raw, ugly sound of men who think they've won something. Mocking her. Making jokes about her size, her gender, her silence. One of them yanked the hood off and she just sat there, wrists bound, head slightly tilted, eyes moving slowly across each face like she was memorizing them, cataloging them. And then she did something that should have warned them. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a defeated laugh. A calm, amused, utterly unsettling laugh that came from somewhere deep and cold. One Marine, Corporal Mason Ivers, stepped closer and asked, "What's funny?" She didn't answer immediately. She just kept looking at them with that expression that said she knew something they didn't. Something important. Before this turns violent, before I tell you what happened in that room, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Because what happened next wasn't supposed to be survivable. Not for her. Not according to every tactical manual, every training protocol, every statistical analysis of 9 armed men versus 1 restrained woman. But those numbers don't account for everything. They don't account for skill so refined it becomes instinct. They don't account for training so brutal it rewires your nervous system. And they sure as hell don't account for the kind of person who walks into hell and comes out holding the devil's leash. They underestimated her. That's where it all began. Staff Sergeant Cole Reddick was in command of that unit, and he stood there with his arms crossed, radiating confidence. His men arranged themselves around the room like they were guarding a high-value target. Like she was dangerous. But not dangerous enough. They saw exhaustion in her posture. They saw disorientation in her silence. They counted the odds and came up with 9 to 1. 9 trained Marines against 1 woman half their average size with her hands bound behind her back. The math made them sloppy. The superiority made them blind. Because she wasn't exhausted. She was conserving energy. She wasn't disoriented. She was mapping exit points, calculating distances, measuring reaction times. Every Marine who shifted his weight, every weapon that swung loose on its sling, every momentary glance away, she cataloged it all with the precision of a predator that's learned patience the hard way. They believed they were dominant. They believed she was prey. And in that belief, they sealed their fate. But you need to understand why she was different. You need to understand what made Rowan Hale something more than just another operator in the teams. She didn't talk about her qualifications. She didn't need to. The instructors at Fort Bragg, the guys who ran the advanced SEER courses, the counterinterrogation specialists who'd broken trained operators just to prove a point, they all taught her like she was already beyond their level. Not because she bragged. Not because she demanded special treatment. But because when they put her through capture-resistant scenarios, when they tied her up and locked her in rooms designed to break the human spirit, she found ways out that made them rewrite their playbooks. She'd spent 3 years in specialized roles that most SEALs never even hear about. Counterinterrogation wasn't just theory for her. It was muscle memory. Room clearing while restrained wasn't a training exercise. It was Tuesday. She'd done real combat extractions in places where one mistake meant a video of your execution went viral before your family even knew you were missing. And through all of it, she never once acted like she was elite. She just performed. Quietly. Efficiently. While others collected medals and gave interviews, she collected skills and stayed invisible. The instructors who trained her said she had something rare. Not rage. Not vengeance. Just absolute clarity under pressure. When your hands are bound and your options are limited, most people panic. Their breathing accelerates. Their vision tunnels. Their decision-making collapses. Rowan Hale's heart rate dropped. Her vision expanded. She saw more when she had less. And that's what those Marines couldn't comprehend. They thought they'd reduced her options. They'd actually just focused her attention. So when they started to relax, when they made the fatal mistake of believing their own dominance narrative, she shifted. Internally. Strategically. Corporal Ivers removed his helmet. Lance Corporal Evan Tully slung his rifle and leaned against the wall. Another Marine turned his back to grab something from a supply pack. Reddick himself uncrossed his arms and started talking about next steps, about transport protocols, about how this was going to play out. They were making plans. She was making calculations. And the moment one of them told a joke, some crude comment about female operators, and 3 of them laughed, she knew. She knew they'd just made their last mistake. Because professionals don't celebrate before the mission is complete. Warriors don't mock enemies they haven't neutralized. And anyone who's survived real combat knows that the most dangerous moment is when you think you've won. They were standing too close. All of them. That's what she kept thinking as she sat there, wrists bound, watching them cluster around her like she was an artifact in a museum. Something to observe. Something to discuss. Something harmless. Corporal Ivers stepped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. He grabbed her shoulder roughly, fingers digging in like he was trying to prove something. "You think this is funny?" He asked again, because her earlier laugh had apparently lodged in his brain like a splinter. And she laughed again. Quieter this time. Colder. The kind of laugh that should have triggered every survival instinct they had. He tightened his grip. "Answer me." She looked up at him with eyes that had gone flat and empty. No fear. No anger. Just cold assessment. And she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "No. I think you're all standing too close." 28 seconds. That's how long it took. 28 seconds to dismantle 9 Marines so thoroughly that 3 of them would require medical evacuation, and the rest would spend months in career counseling. I want you to understand that this wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge. This was technical execution performed with surgical precision by someone who'd trained for this exact scenario hundreds of times. The zip tie around her wrists wasn't a restraint. It was a weapon. She'd positioned her hands during the initial binding so that when she rotated her shoulders and applied pressure to a specific point, the plastic didn't break. It shifted. And in that shift, she had mobility. The first Marine went down in under 2 seconds. Ivers never saw it coming. She drove her forehead into his nose with enough force to crack bone, and while he was stumbling backward with blood pouring down his face, she used his body as a pivot point to generate momentum. Her boot caught him behind the knee, and he went down hard. She was already moving toward the second Marine before the first hit the ground. This is important. She didn't stop to confirm the damage. She didn't pause to admire her work. She flowed, like water finding every crack in a dam. The second and third Marines collided with each other when they tried to react simultaneously. One reached for his sidearm. The other moved to physically restrain her. Both decisions were wrong. She used the momentum of the second Marine's advance against him, redirecting his body mass into the third Marine with enough force that they both crashed into the wall. The sound of impact echoed in that concrete room like thunder. Before they could recover, she'd secured one of their sidearms and used it not to shoot, but to create distance and leverage. The weapon became a baton, a steering wheel, a point of pressure against nerve clusters and joint locks. Marines 4 and 5 tried to coordinate. They'd trained for close-quarters combat. They knew the protocols. But protocols assume a certain baseline reality. They assume your opponent is where they're supposed to be. Rowan Hale was never where she was supposed to be. She moved through their defensive formation like it didn't exist. A knee to a liver. An elbow to a temple. A wrist lock that became a throw that became a sweep that put 2 more men on the ground gasping for air. Number 6 got his hands on her. He was bigger. Stronger. He used his mass to drive her toward the wall, probably thinking he could pin her, neutralize the threat. She let him think that for exactly half a second. Then she dropped her weight, changed her angle, and used his momentum to flip him over her hip. He hit the ground so hard the air left his lungs in one sharp explosion of sound. She didn't look back. Marines 7 and 8 were already moving. They were smarter. They tried to create distance, to use their weapons, to establish firing positions. But distance is relative when someone moves faster than you can track. She closed the gap before they could raise their rifles. One strike to the throat. One sweep to the knee. Both men down. Staff Sergeant Reddick was the last one standing. He'd been frozen for most of it, brain unable to process what his eyes were seeing. 9 Marines. 28 seconds. All of them neutralized by a woman whose hands had been zip-tied when this started. He tried to reach for his radio, probably to call for backup, probably to report a situation that his training manual didn't have a protocol for. She was on him before his fingers touched the transmit button. She didn't hurt him as badly as the others. Just enough to put him on the ground. Just enough to make sure he was conscious for what came next. She stood there in the center of that room, breathing calmly, while 9 Marines lay around her in various states of consciousness and pain. Some were out cold. Some were writhing. Some were trying to move but couldn't because she'd struck nerve clusters that temporarily disabled motor function. Corporal Ivers was still conscious, barely, blood covering his face, staring at her with an expression that was equal parts terror and disbelief. She looked down at him. Didn't gloat. Didn't speak. Just looked. And in that look was everything they needed to understand about who they'd really captured. She didn't fight them one by one. She collapsed the room. The silence after was louder than the violence. That's what nobody talks about. That moment when the chaos ends and reality has to catch up. Staff Sergeant Reddick lay there on his back, radio in his hand, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what had just happened with everything he thought he knew about combat. Lance Corporal Tully, the one who'd been hesitant from the start, the one who hadn't laughed at the jokes, was conscious, but paralyzed by fear. He'd watched the entire thing, seen every movement, and his brain couldn't process it, couldn't file it into any category he understood. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The math didn't work. The physics didn't make sense. 9 trained Marines don't just lose to one restrained woman. Except they had. And now they had to live with that. Rowan stood there, still breathing calmly, like she'd just finished a light workout. Her wrists were free now. The zip tie lay on the ground, broken not by force, but by technique. She hadn't screamed. Hadn't grunted. Hadn't made any of the sounds people make when they're exerting themselves to the limit. Because for her, this hadn't been the limit. This had been Tuesday. This had been a training scenario she'd run through so many times it was boring. And these Marines, these 9 men who'd thought they were predators, were learning a lesson that would follow them for the rest of their lives. You're not Apex until you've met someone higher on the chain. The radios crackled first. Someone had heard something. Or maybe one of the Marines had managed to trigger an alert before going down. Either way, the sound of boots on concrete echoed through the corridor outside. Heavy. Fast. Urgent. The door burst open and senior command poured in. Colonel Marcus Vale was first through, followed by Commander Lucas Marin and a security team. They came in ready for a crisis. Ready for a hostage situation. Ready for casualties. What they found made them all stop dead. 9 Marines on the ground. 1 woman standing in the center of the room. No weapons drawn. No active threat. Just aftermath. Vale's eyes moved across the scene like he was reading a crime report. His expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that looked like recognition. He knew who Rowan Hale was. He'd read her file. But reading about someone and seeing the evidence of their capabilities are two very different things. Commander Marin, her actual commanding officer, walked slowly into the room and surveyed the damage. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. Not in her. In the situation. In what should have been a controlled exercise and had turned into something else entirely. "Hale," Vale said, voice tight and controlled. "Colonel," she replied, tone neutral. "What happened here?" She looked at him like the question was irrelevant. They underestimated the scenario. That's when it clicked for Reddick. That's when he understood. This wasn't a prisoner capture gone wrong. This was an evaluation. A test. And his unit had failed spectacularly. He tried to sit up, winced at the pain in his ribs, and managed to get to his knees. "Sir, we were told this was a joint exercise. We were told to secure the asset and hold position." "You were told to secure," Vale said coldly. "Not to mock. Not to manhandle. Not to turn this into a dominance display." The truth came out in pieces. Dripped into the room like poison. This had been a joint training exercise. Marines and SEALs. The scenario was simple. Marines would secure a high-value individual for transport. SEALs would test how well they could maintain operational security under capture conditions. It was supposed to be professional. Controlled. A learning opportunity for both sides. The Marines were supposed to treat her like she was dangerous. Like she was skilled. Like she deserved respect. Instead, they'd treated her like a trophy. Like a joke. Like someone to be dominated rather than secured. The capture wasn't unauthorized. The disrespect was. Commander Marin walked over to Rowan. Stood close enough that only she could hear him. "You were supposed to stop at 3. She met his eyes without flinching. "You were supposed to stop at none." He didn't argue. Couldn't argue. Because she was right. The moment those Marines started laughing, the moment they started mocking, the moment they decided to treat this like a game, they'd violated every protocol that made joint exercises safe. And she'd responded the only way that made sense. By showing them exactly why protocols exist. By teaching them what happens when you mistake patience for weakness. By giving them a lesson so brutal they'd never forget it. Vale ordered medical evacuation for the 3 worst cases. Ivers with his broken nose and possible concussion. 2 others with injuries serious enough to require hospital assessment. The rest would recover on their own. But the injuries weren't the real consequence. The real consequence came later. In written reports that would follow these Marines for the rest of their careers. In fitness evaluations that would note judgment failures and tactical incompetence. In the way other operators would hear about this and know exactly what kind of professionals these men were. Or weren't. No press releases went out. No medals were awarded. No formal charges were filed. Because that's how these things work when both sides have something to lose. The Marines had lost credibility. The SEALs had proven a point that maybe didn't need to be proven quite so violently. So it all got buried in paperwork and sealed reports and career moves that looked natural but weren't. 3 Marines were quietly reassigned to desk positions. 2 more left the service within the year. Reddick stayed in, but his career trajectory flatlined. He'd been on track for company command. Now he'd be lucky to make it to retirement without being passed over again. And Rowan? Rowan Hale went back to work. Didn't give interviews. Didn't write memoirs. Didn't leverage the incident into fame or recognition. She just kept doing what she'd always done. Operating. Training. Teaching. Staying invisible. Because that's who she was. Not loud. Not vengeful. Not interested in glory. Just precise. Just professional. Just someone who understood that the real warriors don't need to prove anything. They just need to perform when it matters. But the story spread anyway. That's the thing about moments like this. You can't really contain them. People talk. Operators trade stories. Someone who heard from someone who was there tells someone else. And gradually, the legend builds. Not because she wanted it to. Not because she encouraged it. But because what happened in that room was so far outside normal parameters that it became myth. 9 Marines. 28 seconds. 1 woman. The numbers alone don't capture it. Don't explain it. Don't do justice to what actually happened. But they're enough to make people pay attention. She captured their respect for life. That's what someone said later, trying to explain what the incident really meant. Those Marines went into that room thinking respect was something you took. That dominance was proof of capability. That strength meant you could do whatever you wanted to whoever was weaker. They came out understanding something different. Understanding that respect is earned through competence, not coercion. That real strength doesn't need to announce itself. That the most dangerous person in any room is usually the one you underestimate. Petty Officer Noah Keene was the medic who treated the injured Marines. He'd been outside during the incident, called in after to deal with the casualties. He saw the damage, saw the patterns of injury, saw the way every strike had been measured, calculated, designed to disable without causing permanent harm. She could have killed them, he said later, in a conversation that was supposed to stay private. Every single one of them. Could have crushed windpipes, ruptured organs, caused traumatic brain injuries. She didn't. She controlled it. Even in the middle of it, even when 9 men were trying to overwhelm her, she maintained control. That's what the records don't show. That's what the reports can't capture. The discipline it takes to hurt someone exactly enough and no more. The awareness required to track 9 threats simultaneously while managing your own adrenaline, your own fear, your own instinct to survive at any cost. Most people in that situation would have panicked, would have lashed out, would have done whatever it took to escape, consequences be damned. Rowan Hale fought 9 men while simultaneously ensuring none of them would die from their injuries. That's not just skill. That's something deeper. That's mastery. Colonel Vale requested a private meeting with her 3 days after the incident. It happened in his office. No witnesses. No recording. Just 2 professionals having a conversation about what had happened and what it meant. He asked her if she'd known it would escalate like that. If she'd gone into the scenario planning to take down the entire unit. She told him the truth. She'd hoped they'd be professional. Hoped they'd treat it like a real operation. But the moment they started laughing, the moment Ivers grabbed her with contempt instead of caution, she'd made a decision. Not to teach them a lesson. Not to prove a point. Just to survive using every tool she had. And if that survival happened to demonstrate a broader truth about underestimating people, well, that was just a bonus. Vale asked her if she had any regrets. She looked at him for a long moment, considering. Then she said, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that 9 Marines had to learn humility through pain instead of through respect. But do I regret defending myself when they turned a professional scenario into a dominance game? No, I don't regret that at all. He nodded. Told her he understood. Told her the incident would be filed in a way that protected everyone involved. Told her she should probably avoid joint exercises with that particular unit for the foreseeable future. She agreed. Shook his hand. Left his office. Went back to her team. Never spoke about it again unless directly asked. And even then, her answers were brief. Clinical. Focused on tactical lessons rather than personal vindication. Because that's who Rowan Hale was. Someone who understood that the real measure of a warrior isn't how much damage they can do. It's how much they can control. How much they can endure without losing themselves. How much they can hold back even when every instinct screams to go further. Those Marines tested her. Not the way they thought they were testing her. Not by securing her or restraining her or following their protocols. They tested her by forcing her to choose between her training and her anger. Between her discipline and her desire to make them hurt. And she chose discipline. She chose control. She chose to be exactly as violent as necessary and not one fraction more. That's the story nobody tells when they talk about her. They talk about the 28 seconds. They talk about 9 Marines on the ground. They talk about the statistics and the improbability and the sheer physical impossibility of what she did. But they don't talk about what she didn't do. They don't talk about the restraint. They don't talk about the split-second decisions to strike nerve clusters instead of throats, to break grips instead of bones, to disable instead of destroy. Because in those 28 seconds, she could have killed every single person in that room, could have turned it into a massacre, could have let her anger at their disrespect, their mockery, their assumption of dominance, guide her hands toward lethal force. She didn't. And that's what makes her dangerous. Not the violence she's capable of. The violence she chooses not to use. The other SEALs on her team knew something had happened. They could see it in the way she moved for a few days after. A little more careful. A little more aware. Like she'd been reminded of something important and was processing it. They didn't push her to talk about it. That's not how it works in the teams. You trust that people will share what needs to be shared when it needs to be shared. And if they don't share, you trust that they're handling it. Rowan was handling it, processing it, filing it away in whatever mental database she used to store experiences that mattered. About a week later, she was running a training session for new candidates, teaching them counter-interrogation techniques, how to maintain mental clarity under stress, how to manage pain without losing focus, how to find opportunities in impossible situations. One of the candidates, a young woman who just passed BUD/S, asked her about capture scenarios, about what to do when you're outnumbered and restrained and the people holding you don't see you as a threat. Rowan looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You make them see. Not by talking, not by threatening, but by being so undeniably competent that even their arrogance can't blind them anymore." The candidate asked how you do that. How you maintain that level of competence under those conditions. Rowan smiled. Not a happy smile. A knowing smile. A smile that said she'd been there and survived it and knew exactly how hard it was. You train like your life depends on it. Because someday it will. And when that day comes, when you're zip-tied in a room full of people who think they're better than you, who think your gender or your size or your silence makes you weak, you remember that their assumptions are your weapon. Their confidence is your opportunity, and their mistake is your mission. She never mentioned the Marines, never told the story directly, but the lessons were there, embedded in her teaching, woven into her training protocols. Every time she taught someone how to escape restraints, she was teaching them what she'd learned in that room. Every time she demonstrated how to use an opponent's momentum against them, she was passing on knowledge earned in blood and bruises and 28 seconds that changed everything. The candidates didn't need to know the specifics. They just needed to understand the principles. And Rowan made sure they understood. Commander Marin watched her during those training sessions. Saw how she'd shifted. Not broken. Not traumatized. Just refined. Like the incident had burned away any remaining doubts about her own capabilities. He mentioned it to her once, casually, after a session. "You seem different since the exercise." "I'm clearer," she said. "About what?" "About who I am. About what I'm capable of. About the difference between being respected and being feared." She paused. "They feared me after. But they didn't respect me. Fear is what happens when someone hurts you and you don't understand why. Respect is what happens when someone shows you exactly how much they could hurt you and chooses not to." Marin nodded. "You think they learned that?" "Some of them. The smart ones." Tully understood. You could see it in his eyes during the aftermath. He knew I could have killed him. Knew I chose not to. That'll stay with him. Make him better. The others. She shrugged. The others learned to be afraid. And fear without understanding just makes people cruel. It's been 3 years since that incident. 3 years of operations and training and missions that remain classified. Rowan Hale is still in the teams. Still operating. Still teaching. Still maintaining that careful balance between visibility and anonymity. She's not famous. She doesn't want to be. Fame is a liability in her line of work. But within the community, among the people who matter, her name carries weight. Not because she talks about what she's done, but because the people who've worked with her, the operators who've seen her perform under pressure, they talk. They tell the younger generation what's possible. They use her as an example of what happens when you combine skill with discipline. When you train so hard that impossible becomes irrelevant. The Marines involved have scattered. Different units, different bases, different lives. But they carry it with them. That memory, that lesson. Some of them became better operators because of it. Learned humility. Learned to never assume. Learned that disrespect is a tactical error that can get you killed. Others just became more careful, more cautious, more aware that the person who looks like easy prey might actually be the apex predator they should have run from. Either way, they were changed. Marked by an experience that didn't make the news but made them different. Lance Corporal Tully requested a transfer to a joint training unit 6 months after the incident. He wanted to work with SEALs, wanted to learn from them. He wrote in his transfer request that he'd witnessed something that changed his understanding of what operators were capable of, and he wanted to develop those capabilities himself. His request was granted. He's still in the service now. Does good work. Treats every operation with the respect it deserves. And when new Marines under his supervision start getting cocky, start assuming they're dominant because they're bigger or stronger or more numerous, he tells them a story. He doesn't use names, doesn't give details that could be traced back. But he tells them about 9 Marines who learned the hard way that assumptions kill. And every single one of them listens. Corporal Ivers left the service. Medical discharge for injuries sustained during training. The broken nose healed. The concussion resolved. But something else broke that day that couldn't be fixed with surgery or time. His confidence. His sense of invincibility. He'd gone into that room believing he was untouchable. He'd left it knowing he was just flesh and bone and error. Some people can integrate that knowledge and become wiser. Ivers couldn't. So he left. Went into private security. Does okay. But the people who work with him say he's different. More hesitant. Less decisive. Like he's always waiting for someone to prove him wrong again. Staff Sergeant Reddick stayed in. He had to. Military was all he knew. But his career stalled. The incident wasn't officially on his record. But people knew. Word spreads. And when you're the Marine who let a restrained SEAL take out your entire unit, when you're the leader who failed so spectacularly that it became legend, promotions stop coming. Opportunities dry up. He's still in uniform. Still pulling a paycheck. But he knows he'll never make it to company command now. He'll retire at his current rank and spend the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he'd just treated that exercise with the respect it deserved. But Rowan doesn't think about them much anymore. She's moved on. Moved forward. Because that's what you do. You take the lessons. You file away the experience. You use it to inform future decisions. And then you let it go. Holding on to anger or resentment or pride about what happened is just weight you don't need to carry. She's got missions to plan. People to train. Operations to execute. The Marines in that room were just one more scenario. One more test. One more opportunity to prove that preparation and discipline will always beat confidence and assumption. That's what the people who talk about her don't understand. They focus on the violence. On the 28 seconds. On the impossible statistics. But the real story isn't about what she did to those Marines. It's about what she didn't do. It's about the choice she made every single second of that encounter to be exactly as violent as necessary and not one fraction more. It's about the discipline required to fight 9 people while simultaneously calculating the minimum force required to neutralize each threat. It's about the awareness needed to track everything happening around you while managing your own physiological response to danger. Most people can't do that. Most people, when they're fighting for their life, when they're outnumbered and restrained and being disrespected, they just react. They do whatever it takes to survive. They don't measure. They don't calculate. They don't control. Rowan Hale did all three, while zip-tied, while being mocked, while 9 Marines assumed she was helpless. And that's what makes her different. Not better. Not special. Just different. Because she'd trained for that moment her entire career. Had prepared for that scenario through thousands of hours of practice. And when it arrived, when it was real instead of training, she didn't panic. She performed. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about what strength really means, if it challenged your assumptions about size and gender and capability, like the video. Subscribe. And comment where you're watching from. Because the most dangerous people in the world are the ones you laugh at first. The ones you underestimate because they don't fit your mental image of what threat looks like. The ones who sit quietly while you make your mistakes and catalog every error for future use. The ones who could destroy you but choose not to because they understand something you don't. They understand that real power isn't about domination. It's about choice. And the most powerful choice is the one to show mercy to people who don't deserve it. To teach through restraint instead of destruction. To prove your point without ending lives. Rowan Hale captured 9 Marines' respect for life in 28 seconds. Not by killing them, but by showing them how easily she could have and choosing not to. That lesson cost them their pride, their confidence, and in some cases their careers. But it saved their lives. And maybe, for the smart ones like Tully, it made them better. Made them understand that the person across from you is always more than what you assume. Always more capable. Always more dangerous. Always more deserving of respect than your prejudices want to admit. They thought they'd captured a female SEAL. They were wrong. They'd captured a professional who was generous enough to let them survive their mistake. And that's the difference between operators who last and operators who don't. The ones who last understand that every encounter is a choice. Every fight is a decision. And the hardest decision is always the one to hold back. To show restraint. To be merciful to people who've earned nothing but pain. Because that's what separates warriors from killers. Warriors know when not to kill. Killers only know when response. And Rowan Hale was a warrior. Is a warrior. Will always be a warrior. Because she proved it in the only way that matters. Not by how many people she hurt, but by how many she could have killed and didn't.